You were a member of a cult?
Well, it was really a mixture of things. I was in a political cult for about 10 and a half years. For a lot of that time was in leadership positions and had to carry out acts that now I find reprehensible, and it was a very, very stressful time.
Do you feel comfortable telling us about any of those acts?
Well, sure.
Let's get into the rise and fall of this 70s communist cult. Here we go, we're going. When we think of the stereotypical cult, we might imagine hooded figures conducting sacrificial ceremonies. Or strange religious cults where you have to exorcise aliens out of your body using lie detectors made by children. But listen, not all cults are religious, and today we are looking at a political cult, the Democratic Workers' Party, or DWP, founded by Marlene Dixon in 1974. Every cult needs its charismatic leader with the Riz, and for the DWP, that leader was certainly Marlene Dixon, a Marxist thinker and popular professor teaching sociology at the University of Chicago. At its core, Marxism focuses on the idea that society is divided into classes, and this division leads to conflict and inequality.
Well, it's not fair, but not a lot of things are fair.
Dixon was dismissed from her job in 1969, which led to widespread student protests. Officially, Dixon's contract was not renewed, but many students believe the real reason was for her strong leftist opinions in a politically tense 1960s Chicago. The political issues of the 1960s, especially in the US, were defined by a mix of domestic social movements and global conflicts.
Imagine this spot was once a bloody battlefield. 50 years ago was a time when civil rights were legal, but the resistance was lethal. A time of war and body counts and assassinations.
Sounds familiar. This decade set the stage for the more radical politics of the 1970s and reshaped public consciousness on issues like race, war, gender, and the role of government. Some of the major political issues of the 1960s included the Civil Rights Movement, which aimed to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans, particularly in the southern United States. Key events included the 1963 March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Today is a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield.
There was violent resistance, especially in the South, to desegregation and the voting rights for Black Americans. There was also the escalation of the Vietnam War. The US became deeply involved in Vietnam in the early 1960s, officially to prevent the spread of communism under the domino theory.
The domino theory was a Cold War misperception that when one nation embraced communist doctrine, then neighboring nations would succumb to the same fate, like dominoes falling in a row.
There were many protests as the war dragged on. Anti-war protests grew, particularly on college campuses. The anti-war movement, fueled by the draft and rising US casualties, became one of the defining political struggles of the decade.
One of the largest peace demonstrations in history was held last October in Washington. More than 50,000 persons took part, and thousands of them marched on the Pentagon to protest the war. A leader of that demonstration was Jerry Rubin, a radical activist of the so-called New Left. We recently asked him his view of the limits of dissent.
We're living in the middle of a beast. Lyndon Johnson is a common murderer, and he should be arrested for murder. There are no limits to dissent. I think the peace movement should have the anger of a Vietnamese woman whose child was burned by napalm, dropped by American planes, way up there in the sky. That's the anger the peace movement should reflect. The peace movement's got to go into the streets, and it's got to use the tactic of disruption, because the American people are drunk with apathy, because they don't care. Our country is now in the situation that Germany was in the 40s. We're committing mass murder.
Governor Wallace, speaking in Akron, Ohio last month, gave his views on the limitations of dissent.
Students who raised money and blood and clothes for the Viet Cong communists, send it overseas to help use against American servicemen, And those who speak and call for the victory of the communists in the name of academic freedom are giving morale support and are aiding and abetting the enemy in Hanoi, Peking, and Moscow. And if I were the president, the first thing I would do is have my attorney general drag some of these bearded professors making such speeches before a grand jury and indict them and send them off to the penitentiary for what they are, traitors, because they are traitors.
The Vietnam War caused deep divisions within American society. It was the first televised war, and footage of the conflict deeply impacted public opinion. Can't forget about the Cold War tensions, including the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a high-stakes confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union over the installation of Soviet missiles in Cuba. It was a pivotal moment in the Cold War, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war before a negotiated resolution.
I should like to say
Продолжайте вашу речь, господин Стивенсон. В свое время вы получите ответ.
Monsieur Stevenson, vous recevrez votre réponse en temps voulu, n'ayez pas peur.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared.
In the 1960s, nuclear weapons and the fear of a nuclear conflict were constant political issues. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963 sought to reduce some of these tensions. And who can forget the space race? The space race was a key aspect of Cold War competition. The US saw NASA's Apollo program culminating in the 1969 moon landing as a way to demonstrate technological and ideological superiority over the Soviet Union. Although conspiracy theorists will tell you that it was all a soundstage and we couldn't have possibly ever landed on the moon. We also saw the rise of women's rights and feminism, well, the second wave of feminism, which were focused on issues beyond legal equality, including reproductive rights, workplace discrimination, and societal roles.
Much more. They're the sexiest super ladies on the scene. They're the women who rate a 10 later tonight.
You're absolutely right. It's neat and quick, and it goes on dry. It did make me feel cool and sweet, just as you said. I did everything you said, but my boss still hasn't asked me to lunch.
Unlike some deodorants, Fresh doesn't guarantee you'll get ahead in business. All Fresh does is keep you fresh.
When there's no man around, Goodyear should be. Why? Watch this. New Goodyear Double Eagle. Carries its own spare inside. Lifeguard safety spare. A tire in a tire. Keeps on going. Next time, give her a second chance.
Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique in 1963, is often credited with sparking this wave. The book focused on the dissatisfaction and sense of unfulfillment felt by many American women, especially housewives in the post-World War II era.
The majority of American women in many age groups are working outside their home, but most of them are working at low-paid, relatively low-skilled jobs, often in a dead end from professional advancement, and they are not really taking part in the decision-making areas of American life in anything except token numbers.
Friedan's work challenged traditional gender norms and inspired countless women to demand greater equality and opportunities. In 1969, there were several women's marches and other events that took place, including a women's strike for equality and an abortion speak-out. Betty Friedan led down a march down Fifth Avenue in New York City that drew an estimated 50,000 women. The march was part of a day-long strike where women refused to work or do household chores to highlight unequal pay and job opportunities for women. The National Organization for Women, NOW, was founded in 1966 and played a pivotal role in advancing women's rights, including pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, and broader societal changes. There was a cultural revolution with many young people in the 1960s, particularly in the US and Western Europe, rejected mainstream society and embraced counterculture values. This era saw a shift in attitudes towards sex, drugs, authority, authority and individual freedom, epitomised by events like the 1969 Woodstock Festival.
3-day Aquarian exposition at White Lake and Bethel, New York will give you uncomplicated, unhurried, calm days of peace and music. Friday, August 15th, you'll hear...
We cannot forget about the free speech movement in 1964. The 1964 protest at UC Berkeley was a precursor to wider student activism, demanding academic freedom and more democratic university governance. We had a couple of assassinations as well. Obviously, John F. Kennedy in 1963. The assassination of President Kennedy shocked the world and marked the beginning of a turbulent period in US politics. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. Both of the assassinations of these two leaders were major blows to the civil rights and progressive movements, fueling unrest and contributing to a sense of instability. As part of the broader movements for social justice, there was increased focus on protecting civil liberties, particularly free speech, freedom of assembly, and the freedom of the press. The rise of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and legal battles in the Supreme Court reflected this trend. On November 13, 1968, sociology professor Marlene Dixon went too far. Chicago Maroon reports that during a faculty procession at the inauguration of Edward Levi, the university's 8th president, instead of joining her fellow staff members, Marlene Dixon protested alongside 100 students, chanting, "Work, study, get ahead, kill." A fair response to the draft requirements during the Vietnam War. 2 months later, when the sociology department unanimously declined to renew Dixon's appointment for a second term, some students recalled Marlene's earlier show of solidarity. In early January, students banded together as a committee of 75 and sent an open letter to the Maroon, demanding that Dixon be rehired and that students be given an equal say in decisions to hire and fire professionals. The sit-in protest they carried out began on January 30th, 1969 and ended on February 14th in 1969. Valentine's Day, that's nice. 400 students overtook the administration building and refused to surrender for 2 weeks. After this, there were consequences. In the March of 1969, the university suspended 81 students, expelled 42 of them, and placed 3 on probation, and even fined 1 for breaking a window. The protest worked, and Dixon was reinstated and offered a 1-year extension of her position, but she declined and resigned. The protest put significant pressure on the University of Chicago, bringing national attention to the issue of academic freedom and the treatment of radical scholars.
In the name of academic freedom are giving morale support and are aiding and abetting the enemy in Hanoi, Peking, and Moscow. And if I were the president, the first thing I would do is have my attorney general drag some of these bearded professors making such speeches before a grand jury and indict them and send them off to the penitentiary for what they are, traitors, because they are traitors.
After her dismissal, Dixon went on to found the Democratic Workers' Party, DWP, which became known for its radical Marxist and feminist positions. Despite the challenges she faced, her work continued to influence leftist thought and activism. Over its 12 years, the Democratic Workers' Party focused on several political and theoretical activities, but it was most known for 3 main things. Number 1 was leading the Tax the Corporations campaigns in San Francisco in 1979 to 1980, which gained a lot of public support and made the DWP an important part of the progressive movement in the Bay Area. The second thing was publishing the Journal of Contemporary Marxism and having members speak at leftist academic events in the US. And number 3 was creating the US out of Central America, the USOCA group in 1983, which opposed US involvement in Central America. The Democratic Workers' Party, under the leadership of Marlene Dixon, exhibited several behaviours that critics and former members describe as cult-like. These behaviours included: number 1, a centralised, authoritarian leadership. Marlene Dixon held a dominant role in the party, exercising significant control over other members. Many former members described her leadership as authoritarian, where dissent or disagreement with Dixon was not tolerated. Members were often required to follow her decisions unquestioningly, which is characteristic of cult-like structures, where a central figure holds absolute power. We've seen a lot of them already. Number 2, isolation from outside influence. Members were encouraged to distance themselves from non-party individuals, including family and friends who might question the party's ideology or goals. This isolation is so typical of cults, where the leaders want to cut members off from external viewpoints or family members that disagree, that could challenge the group's beliefs. Number 3, emotional and psychological manipulation. There were reports that Dixon used emotional manipulation to maintain control, creating an environment where loyalty to her and the party was seen as paramount. Members who questioned her authority were often shamed, humiliated, or subjected to intense criticism, creating a culture of fear. I think they even had like criticism sessions where they would just get roasted. Number 4, demand for total commitment. The DWP demanded complete dedication from its members, expecting them to devote most of their time and energy to the party's activities. This total commitment, which often involves personal sacrifice, resembles cult-like groups that require members to prioritize the group over their personal lives. It's the greater good, you know?
You should be ashamed. Calling yourself a community that cares.
Oh, but we do care, Nicholas.
It's all about the greater good.
The greater good. How can this be for the greater good? The greater good. How can this be for the greater good? The greater good. Shut it!
Number 5, control of information. Dixon controlled much of the information that the members were exposed to, both inside and outside of the party. Cult-like groups often limit access to outside perspectives to maintain control over the members' thoughts and beliefs. This could be like restricting what they can read newspaper-wise or internet access, things like that. Number 6, rigid ideology and groupthink. The DWP promoted a strict ideological line and dissenting views were not tolerated. These behaviours, authoritarian control, isolation, emotional manipulation, total commitment, control of information, created an environment with the DWP that some former members would describe as cult-like. And that sounds pretty cult-like to me, if I'm completely honest. We've seen in Scientology and the other cults we've covered on this channel that is exactly what they do. If you want to find out more about that, please click somewhere where there'll be a link to a playlist. And you can watch more of my videos. I even have a whole iceberg all about Scientology. The DWP eventually disbanded in the late 1980s, with many former members reflecting on their experiences with a sense of disillusionment. The party's collapse was partly due to the unsustainable nature of its authoritarian structure and the psychological toll it took on its members. Several former members of the Democratic Workers' Party have provided testimony and shared their experiences about their time in the organisation. Probably most notable on YouTube and other places is Janja Lalich. She has done tons of interviews and is sort of known as like the cult expert in these parts.
You were a member of a cult?
Well, it was really a mixture of things. I was in a political cult for about 10.5 years, and initially I thought I had really found something. I thought I, finally had a group of people that would give me purpose and meaning, and it was just the most wonderful feeling in the world, although I was, even from the beginning, sort of cautious and skeptical and wondering, well, really, what is this? But as time went on, the group became more and more restrictive and more controlling of my daily life. And I would say, when I think about it, I mean, the thinking back now from that group, I think the main thought that comes to mind is anxiety, confusion, and fear. Those were the main feelings that I had during most of those years. I, for a lot of that time, was in leadership positions and had to carry out acts that now I find reprehensible, and it was a very, very stressful time.
Do you feel comfortable telling us about any of those acts?
Well, sure. I don't, in fact, you know, one of the ways I think it's important for people who leave these groups is to really look back and evaluate what they did and why they did it, and how people got to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. Our group was very abusive in the sense of having constant criticism sessions where we sat in a circle and somebody got blasted, and I was one of the most harsh of the enforcers of that regime. I also expelled many people. I separated couples. I convinced people not to have babies. I convinced people not to go home for their parents' funerals, not to get married to a particular person. I stood guard over people who were under house arrest for weeks at a time. I was part of a special elite team called the Eagles, who served as a bodyguard for the leader and who we were often sent out to intimidate other groups or former members of our own group. So those were the kinds of things we did which weren't very pleasant.
Marlene Dixon's leadership in the Democratic Workers' Party was marked by controversy. The DWP was often criticised for being overly authoritarian, and Dixon herself was accused of exercising too much control over the organisation. The party eventually dissolved in the late 1980s, and Dixon largely withdrew from public political life. Despite the controversies, Dixon's work continues to influence Marxist and feminist thought. She remains a significant figure in the history of American radical politics. Her critiques of capitalism, particularly in relation to gender and class oppression, are still relevant to the contemporary discussions on social justice today. As I was reading about the DWP, I couldn't help but wonder if there were some similarities with the current woke movement of today. I know I'll get in trouble for using that word. If it was actually a cult-like thing. Cancel culture, identity politics, they're all easy to get wrapped up in, especially in the age of social media.
The access to the internet has absolutely expanded the environment, so that there are more internet-based cults than ever before, which has changed things in a way for someone like me, because before you always, you know, you knew where the cult was, you knew where the headquarters was, you knew who the leader was, you knew maybe where their satellites were, but now it's so amorphous. So for example, with QAnon, like, who was the leader of QAnon? Was it that guy and his son? Was it, you know? And so that makes it a little more difficult on one level. But the thing that's really different with the internet-based cults and this past, I don't know, 5 years or so, is that a lot of these groups act outward. They act out against society, which in the past, most cults didn't do that and don't do that. You know, we had a few cases like Om Shinrikyo, the cult in Japan that put the sarin gas in the subway, but most cults basically ruin the lives of their own members.
The woke left have often been likened to a cult by critics. The term woke, coined in the 1940s, simply meant being aware of racial injustice. Nowadays, woke is a catch-all for all social injustice. Critics of the woke left argue that its focus on identity politics and cultural issues can be divisive and actually detracts from class-based or economic struggles. They may claim that certain policies or language practices stifle free speech or create a call-out culture that leads to self-censorship and being worried about what you can say and can't say. Some see the woke left as engaging in moral absolutism, where individuals or ideas are judged harshly based on perceived infractions of these progressive norms, rather than engaging in a dialogue or considering nuance. The misalignment of be kind, but exile anyone who disagrees is jarring, to say the least. Others argue that this movement's focus on dismantling perceived privilege or oppressor groups leads to an overly adversarial view of society, where people are simplistically divided into the oppressors and the oppressed. I hesitate to say that the woke left is a cult, because listen, they don't have a leader or any rituals that I'm aware of. I think the woke left could be akin to maybe like football fans. You know, their identity is defined by the team, you know, so de-individuation and tribalism kind of can occur. And this basically happens where individuals within a large group lose their sense of self-awareness and personal accountability. In the context of football crowds, this can result in fans engaging in behaviour they might not normally display, like yelling at people or being violent or vandalising, fighting with fans, that kind of thing. The anonymity of being in a crowd can make people feel less responsible for their actions, leading them to behave in ways that align with the group rather than their personal values.
Who here is Generation Z? Not so bold outside of a TikTok comment section, are we?
The internet, obviously, then, is a place where this kind of in-the-crowd mentality can absolutely thrive. Thanks to the anonymity factor, being safe behind a screen, and the echo chambers that we can fall into, thanks to the algorithms showing us more of the same content we already engage with. I do not think anybody is above falling for a cult. Social media is full of them. And even though the DWP was politically motivated rather than religious, its methods of maintaining control and loyalty bear striking similarities to those we have seen in cults. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you want to see more videos about cults, consider subscribing so you don't miss this series that I'm calling ABCs of Cults. This one was the letter D, DWP. The next one is the letter E. Who knows what that's going to be? You have to subscribe to find out. Okay, bye!